Hello, everybody. I'm George from Ireland. This is about Huntley, one of the United Kingdom's least favourite people. So, Mr. Huntley is serving a 40-year sentence for the murder of two little girls, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, whom he murdered, I think, by drowning in the bath in August 2002 in the sleepy Cambridgeshire village of Soham. But Huntley's been attacked in prison again. I think it's the second very serious attack. With a weapon somewhat fashioned by another prisoner in the workshop or something. He says that Ian Huntley may never recover his eyesight, currently in the hospital wing. So, I mean, obviously, Ian Huntley is an evil man, because how could you bring yourself to commit any act of violence against a 10-year-old child, against two totally innocent children, let alone kill them, because he persuaded them to come to his house and then started to commit a sex crime on them. They started screaming, and then he murdered them to cover it up. And then he got his girlfriend, Maxine Carr, to perjure herself to provide an alibi for him. But I mean, eventually he was found guilty of this crime. She was later imprisoned for that lie under oath. So the 40-year sentence, but will he ever be safe to release? Now, I don't support the death penalty. There's some people say, oh, we should just give him to the other prisoners and they should do what they want to him, and, you know, he deserves it, rip him apart. Now, that's barbaric. Surely in a civilized society, even very bad people like Ian Huntley, no matter what he's done, as in murdering these two children, should not suffer such a fate. That's savage. Okay, I don't support the death penalty. When we did at least have the death penalty, you know, if someone's to be killed, he or she should be killed as quickly and as painlessly as possible, not stringing it out. That just leads to the general brutalization of society. It's revolting, because, you know, society, we've got to be better than people like Ian Huntley and not sink to that level and not, you know, seem to make a virtue out of violence. So, you know, there's a possibility for rehabilitation. I hope he's remorseful. He recognizing he just did an utterly appalling thing, you know, is conscience stricken, is weighed down by guilt. You know, how can he ever make it up to the families of these children? These little girls themselves, they're never going to be released from the grave. But, you know, there's certainly evil in him. I like to think there's some good in him. Maybe I delude myself. But I remember as a cause célèbre at the time, I mean, I was abroad on holiday, came back, heard about this, and a lot of this stuff about Criminal Records Bureau check we used to say about it, because he was a school janitor, which is how he knew the children. But and perhaps he shouldn't have been, because he had one minor conviction for theft, which is allowed to cover up as something like driving a motorcycle without a license, and that was allowed to lie on file rather than be prosecuted, something like that. And then the social workers, they knew that he was in sexual relationship with a 14-year-old. It being the late 90s, they let that drift. They even interviewed the girl in his immediate presence. Are you happy with the situation? Obviously, it would not be tolerated these days. And then society had a bee in its bonnet about this. I mean, obviously, it's terrible. I don't want kids to be murdered. I don't dismiss that. But as though that everybody who works in schools, particularly men, is Ian Huntley, potentially. I remember I hear about some man who was teaching at another school, and I don't know why his CRB hadn't come through or something. So another adult had to be in the classroom with at all times, as though he was about to murder one child in the presence of 25 others or something. So this is just one of those, you know, lightning strike events. And then we behave as though the whole male sex is to be suspected like this. So, yeah, I'm unsupportive of the death penalty. In the case of Saddam Hussein, and we would not plead for his life, but I'm glad that even in the case of a very wicked person like Ian Huntley, that he's not been put to death. But a prison officer did point out it's costing to me. I happened to sit beside one on a plane years ago. It's thousands of pounds a day to keep him alive, on suicide watch in some isolation wing, to protect him from the other prisoners murdering him. Would you even want to live? I mean, imagine being him, weighed down by that guilt, the most detested person in the United Kingdom. When he comes out, where could he ever live? And there are people seeking vengeance upon you. And I remember some Conservative politician in the 1980s saying, well, if we're not going to have capital punishment, why don't we just give them a razor blade and suggest they do the decent thing? If they want to end their own lives, why shouldn't they? I mean, they may well have this right to die. So for very elderly people who are incurable conditions, in agony, and if they're unable to end their own lives, be assisted. Something like the Dignitas Clinic in Switzerland even established one in the United Kingdom. Republic of Ireland, we're not debating that. But, you know, is it worth it for the public to pay so much money to keep him alive What if he doesn't want to live on? I suppose people can go on hunger strike, but may not have the willpower just to stop eating or something like that. And I know there's some elderly people who almost stop eating, almost stop drinking at the end. I know it was a contributory factor in the death of someone I knew at the age of 67 in 2020, who was very ill with various conditions, partly from alcohol abuse. So, but will he ever be safe to release? Because you think there's a risk of a recurrence. So what if the parole board determined that it was safe to let him on the streets, and then he commits murder again? You see, that's the thing. So keeping someone in prison, category is something like £70,000 a year. And I would like to think that there's, as Churchill would say, there's a gem in the heart of every man. If only you could find it, we can turn evil people into good people. But perhaps that's naive. I knew someone who was upper middle class who spent 4.5 months in Reading jail in 1990 for credit card fraud, and he said about a quarter of them were genuinely evil, and some of them needed to be in for their own protection were more like psychiatric cases. But about half of them, he said, were not that bad, were a mixture of good and bad, and had a difficult childhood, been beaten up, been molested, were just illiterate, things like that, had got into drugs and drink and things like that, and it felt that could be rehabilitated. Bear in mind the prison population in 1990 was much lower than it is today. But he's committed the worst crime of all, which is murder. And it was one crime to attempt to cover up another, which is an aggravating, of course, and not a mitigating factor. So what is to be done with Ian Huntley? Apparently, the majority of the population's unsupported the death penalty. In those days, the majority would have been in favour, particularly for someone like him, who'd murdered not just one child, two children, and because of the sex crime he was committing against them. So, yeah, he led to changes in the law. And now we're sort of fixated with child protection. You might say that's a good thing, but then there's loads of form filling. The slightest thing has to be reported. Did he look at her the wrong way? Did she crack an off-color joke? Did this person say the wrong word? What's one child doing with another? The way teenagers will interact with each other, is that sexual harassment? And I saw in one college this saying, give us a twirl, love. That's an example of sexual harassment. That's got to be reported. The way everything is so hyper-regulated and policed, all our interactions are seen as like abusive, as though somehow give us a twirl, love is on a continuum with the murder of these two little children. What starts out as ordinary behavior and has a healthy interest in the opposite sex ends up as the murder of these two little children. Well, that truly is preposterous. Obviously, don't want such a crime to ever be committed again. It's ghastly, but it was huge. I mean, 2002, roughly 800 people were murdered in the United Kingdom. Those are the only two murders I can think of. It was particularly shocking because it's kids, and it's because their school janitor who did it to them. I suppose that's why it stands out in the public mind. Children deserving the sympathy of the world more so than anybody else. If it's one drug lord is shot by another drug lord, then people say it's dirt on dirt. But this was, a particularly tragic and heartrending case. What is to be done with Ian Huntley? People like this want to end their lives. Why should they be prevented? I mean, it would harm himself. It wouldn't harm anybody else. You might get depression if you're like him in prison. Imagine being the most hated person in the realm. So couldn't the same principle apply to those who might be allowed to end their lives at some clinic? Remember those who are paralyzed or whatever reason, can't put a pill in their mouth, can't inject themselves, so you can have a machine do it for them. What do you think? Anyway, thanks for watching my video. It's sickening, though, that people who are like Ian Huntley on a huge scale, doctors, nurses, politicians, who murder children on an enormous scale for money and go brag about it, that they get promoted. And they are loaded with knighthoods and damehoods and peerages and promotions and cabinet positions and so forth. And then they have the temerity to make us pay for it and to use this euphemistic language to pretend it's somehow necessary. What he did is he cut these children off from hypoxia until the point of death. And that's what's used against girls and boys on a huge scale in the UK and sadly now in the Republic of Ireland. Well, do what you can to defend children.